Welcome to day 2 of IJNR's workshop on climate justice and environmental racism. We're very excited to have you all back. As we talked about yesterday, the way we're kind of approaching this workshop is looking at different projected climate impacts, sort of from the big national scale, what that means, and then focusing in on a specific location. I'm going to mute you, Christine. Sorry about that. And anyway, so today our first session is going to be about something that I'm sure you've all read about and maybe even written about, which is the Jackson water crisis, which is something that obviously came to light at a national level, got a lot of attention after a climate-fueled extreme rainstorm caused massive flooding that sort of triggered this big issue with the water supply. But what a lot of people may not know, probably President Company excluded, is that this is an issue that's been going on for years and years. And as we talked about yesterday, you know, while redlining sure is no longer legal, there are a number of ways that Black and brown communities are still discriminated against and underserved and disenfranchised. And so we wanted to use Jackson as a way to highlight how that's, you know, not a Jackson only issue. This is something that, especially around drinking water and wastewater and other kinds of infrastructure like that, is probably something you should be paying attention to in your own, you know, areas. So with that preamble aside, I'm going to introduce you to our speakers. First, we're going to hear from Samantha Zolke. She's an assistant professor in the School of Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Iowa. She researches the politics of nonprofits and the environment, specifically how U.S. partisan politics shape the American nonprofit sector, and also investigates the unequal distribution and quality of local public services. She's co-author of the book, The Profits of Distrust, Citizen Consumers, Drinking Water, and the Crisis of Confidence in American Government. So we're happy to have Sam here. She's going to be followed by, I'm letting Aubrey back in. Aubrey Connor, who is Director of Environmental and Climate Justice at the NAACP. Aubrey oversees the strategy and collaboration across the association to dismantle environmental racism. She has taught education law and is currently faculty in the Environmental Policy and Management program at the University of California, Davis. She's a native of Lakeland, Florida, and has served as directing attorney of health and at the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley, where she led litigation, direct legal services work, and advocacy regarding health equity and the social determinants of health that impact historically excluded communities across Silicon Valley. She sat on the Law Foundation's Race, Equity, and Inclusion Steering Committee, was a staff attorney with the ACLU Foundation of Northern California, was named a top 40 under 40 nation's best advocate by the National Bar Association, and a whole other list of things that I'm not going to take the time to list here, but we're really excited to have Aubrey here. And then we're going to meet Brooke Floyd, who is coordinator of the Jackson People's Assembly at the People's Advocacy Institute, which is a nonprofit community resource specializing in training and capacity building for transformative justice in Jackson, Mississippi. Brooke's primary responsibility is organizing assemblies that promote co-governance, and it's work she's been doing for a very long time. Brooke's activism began in 8th grade when she organized a student protest on the steps of the Mississippi State Capitol in response to cuts to public education. So she's been doing it ever since. And she is a 2022-23 fellow of the Black Future Lab's Black to the Future Public Policy Institute. So that's who we're going to hear from this morning. And Sam, if you want to share your screen, go for it. Or if you want me to share your slides, I can do it. Although it looks like something's happening. All right, good. I get to stop talking. And Sam, you can take it from here. I think though, there you go. Yeah.
Okay. Do you all see my presentation format?
Yeah, we do.
Excellent. Okay, thank you for having me. Thanks, Adam, for that nice introduction. My name is Sam Zolke. Before I was an assistant professor, I worked at the National Geographic Society in Washington, D.C. for many years. And so I'm super excited to have the opportunity to share this research with storytellers and science communicators like yourselves. Let's see. Okay, so the core of my remarks today come from a new co-authored book that I wrote with Manny Teodoro at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and with David Switzer from the University of Missouri. I am not going to try and summarize the whole book in 15 minutes, but what I am going to do is share some highlights about tap water problems, environmental justice, to really help inform and hopefully set up the rest of the panelists as we talk about this important problem. If you have questions about data or other findings of the book, I'm happy to talk to them, to speak to them during Q&A, or you also can find the book on Amazon or through Cambridge University Press. But I'm really going to start with a story. So this book started with this map. This map shows Houston, Texas, and the blue dots are the locations of water kiosks like the one pictured here. So water kiosks are standalone structures where individuals drive up, put a couple quarters in, fill their own jugs with gallons of water, and then drive away. So I lived in DC. I'm from the Northeast. We do not have these types of kiosks where I live. So when I moved to Texas, they were this weird kind of phenomenon. And they became weirder to me when I started working with undergraduate researchers who are first generation students that were not as confused by them as I was, right? They, when I asked them about the kiosk, they were like, oh, well, this is where our family gets our water from. And so it really started this mystery of why is there such demand for this type of commercial water product here? The other reason the kiosks are kind of puzzling is because we traditionally associate kiosks with poor water quality, right? Kiosks like this are pretty common in the developing world where water quality is poor or unreliable. But the fact that they're in Houston is weird because Houston has had perfect compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act since 1988. So in the US, drinking water is regulated primarily by the Safe Drinking Water Act. And this act ensures both the health and management of water. So in terms of health, the act regulates what contaminants are able to be in the water. In terms of management, it regulates the processes by which drinking water is treated, but also by which problems about drinking water are communicated to the public. And so it's weird that these kiosks are in Houston because Houston has, by all, generic means, pretty high quality drinking water. The other thing that's kind of weird about this map is the locations of the kiosks themselves. So if kiosks were driven by this water quality story, we would expect to see them sort of spread equally throughout the city because Houston is provided by a single drinking water provider. But that's clearly not the case, right? These kiosks are clustering. And so the question is like, why are these kiosks in particular patterns? And so one additional explanation could be that maybe kiosks are a luxury good. So kiosk water on average costs 25 cents to 35 cents a gallon. And that is roughly 7,000% more expensive than tap water costs in Houston. So in Houston, a gallon of tap water costs you on average about a penny. And so why are these, it could be that these kiosks are locating in high income areas because they're a luxury good. People are willing to pay more for a product that they perceive to be superior. When we layer in income though, that's not the case, right? So on this map, we have median income throughout the city of Houston. Lighter areas represent lower income areas. Darker green areas represent higher income areas. And it's pretty clear to see that the kiosks are locating in the poorest areas of the city. And so this is weird. What we have is groups with the lowest resources in the city spending an exorbitant amount on their drinking water. Things get even more concerning when we layer in racial and ethnic data. So in Houston, we see that kiosks are really likely to locate in Hispanic neighborhoods. We also see that they're fairly likely to locate in Black neighborhoods. So there's a clear racial and ethnic dimension to this story. I mean, what's more, it's not just in Houston, right? So these are the locations of freestanding kiosks that we collected in spring 2017. And as you can see, they're really prevalent throughout the US. Kiosks like Watermill Express are one of the fastest growing franchises in the US. And when we look at where these kiosks are likely to locate, they are in general more likely to locate in places where communities have been politically marginalized in the past. Now, which community is politically marginalized depends on what area of the country you're talking about. So for example, in the Southwest, kiosks are much more likely to locate in Hispanic neighborhoods. And if we trace back kind of the history of institution building in the Southwest, we know that Hispanic groups were cut out of local governments during Reformation. Adam mentioned redlining. Nationwide, if we look at areas that were redlined in the 1930s and 40s, areas that were given C or D ratings are much more likely to have kiosks today. And so we see this legacy of marginalization emerging in really strange ways around drinking water. And it's not just this kiosk water, right? So bottled water in the US has become a behemoth industry. Over the past 20 years, bottled water has become a $20 billion industry. Last year alone, Americans spent $36 billion on drinking water. And this year, Americans will spend nearly $40 billion on drinking water. For context, that averages out to about $25 per month per household in the US. And for comparison, that is about half of the total water utility revenue in the country. So people are spending money on water, but they aren't spending it on public water supplies. So like, what is going on here, right? Why are people willing to spend so much money on products that are more expensive, environmentally destructive, and also less stringently regulated? I mentioned that the Safe Drinking Water Act regulates tap water in the US. By comparison, bottled water is regulated by the FDA. And as far as we can tell, water kiosks are kind of in this no man's land of regulation. The only regulations we can find around them are actually the same kind of regulations that apply to gas stations in terms of, are they selling the volume of water that they say that they're selling? And so we think the answer, and what we propose in the book, is that this exit to commercial water consumption, this demand for private water products, relates to trust in government. So it's no secret, trust in government institutions in the US is at an all-time low. Over the past 20 years, this trust has declined. So in the book, we advance an argument that these trends are not coincidental or happenstance, that these trends are really related, that one of the reasons bottled water and kiosk water has grown into such an industry is because people don't trust the government to provide safe drinking water to them. And so the argument in brief is that when you have tap water failures, it reduces people's trust in government, right? Government does not have the capacity, the capability, the intent of providing safe, clean drinking water to me or to people like me. And so if you don't trust the government to provide safe drinking water to you, it's very rational to purchase private sources of drinking water, even if they're way more expensive. Economists call this practice defensive spending. And so when you are faced with this distrust in government, you can either voice your concerns to government with no guarantee that government will actually listen to you, or you can purchase bottled water or kiosk water. It might be more expensive, but it's easier and you believe it will be safe. Now, the problem with this, among equity concerns, is that when people exit from government's basic services, like consuming tap water, it also leads to reduced political participation. So I'm going to show you I won't show you in a second, but what we find in the book is that people that drink bottled water are less likely to vote, they're less likely to contact their representatives. And this makes sense because you're not relying on the government for this basic service. The problem with this, though, is when you have groups that don't participate in government, it reduces government's incentives to improve or provide good service. And thus, this leads to more tap water failure, and ultimately the cycle continues. So I'm going to show you some brief results in support of this argument. What this figure shows is that when people experience tap water problems, like tap water that tastes bad, or it's dirty or cloudy, low pressure, or it's made them sick, they express lower levels of trust in local government. We find the same for state government and for federal government as well. About 85% of people in the US respond at this level. And you might look at this and think the differences aren't that big. But what they equate to,
Hey,
or
Sam,
they're similar to levels of trust in government between Democrats and Republicans. Yeah.
you're
Oh, can you hear
breaking
me?
up. Yeah, you're freezing and breaking up a little bit.
Okay.
Do you think that's your computer trying to do slides? And
Maybe. Let me go to the next one. Is that better?
yeah, it moves pretty slowly as the slide comes in.
Okay. I'm at a hotel at a conference, so that's
Okay.
maybe that. I can wrap up quickly, or I can
Well,
hand it off.
Yeah, I can just get to that slide, and maybe if you stop screen sharing,
Sure.
it won't be trying so hard.
Okay, great. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. I just want to make sure everyone can hear what you're saying. So I'm going to now share my screen.
Okay, so while you pull that up, Adam, so basically, if people experience tap water problems, it can make a Democrat think about government the way a Republican thinks about government, which is not insignificant. Cool. Okay, so this slide talks about when people don't trust the government, they are much more likely to have bottled water as their primary drinking source. All right, next slide, Adam.
Oops, hold on.
And the problem with this is that the problem, but another interesting element to this is that people do not personally need to experience drinking water problems. So this figure shows how lead testing requests in Providence, Rhode Island increased following the Flint water crisis. Other research shown that bottled water purchasing in Black communities rose following Flint. In our book, we examine not how just crises like Flint or Jackson influence people, but how drinking water problems anywhere can influence other communities if those communities identify with the residents that are experiencing those problems. So for example, we look at how communities that are connected via their identity, so communities with similar levels of Black populations, Hispanic populations, and low income populations. These communities react when there's problems that affect other communities like them elsewhere. And so what we conclude from this is that when these crises happen, it doesn't just affect the local community. When tap water problems happen anywhere, they can cause distrust everywhere and change consumer behavior in other places. Because these crises send a big message to people that government does not serve people like you. Oops, next slide, Adam. And what's more is that commercial water companies seem to be aware of the fact that distrust among the American population is not distributed equally. So if you look at marketing for bottled water or for kiosk water, people of color are frequently featured in these advertising campaigns. Furthermore, a lot of these campaigns straight up tell people in their marketing that tap water is unsafe to drink. For example, Primo water kiosks are frequently found inside Walmarts or grocery chains, and their marketing is a picture of a rusted pipe, and their slogan accompanying it says that your tap water hangs out in some pretty seedy joints. In Primo's filings with the SEC, they list their main growth opportunity as the deteriorating municipal water supply. So you have communities that are predisposed to distrust government for very good reasons. And these for-profit companies are taking advantage of these communities and encouraging them to spend limited resources on expensive bottled water. Next slide, Adam. And so what does this mean, right? This is pretty doom and gloom stuff. And so in the book, we show evidence of how this cycle can be reversed, where if government provides basic services that are excellent, open, and equitable, it can encourage people to re-participate in government and re-engage with government. So by excellence, we mean that government needs to do a better job. They need to provide drinking water that's safe, that tastes good. By openness, we mean that service needs to be transparent. People need to understand where their water is coming from, who to call when they have a problem. And by equitable, we mean that everybody needs to have safe, clean drinking water. And what's more, it's not the responsibilities of these affected communities. Service providers need to be proactive in reaching out to these groups to figure out how to take on that responsibility of providing better water quality. And this matters for lots of reasons, but in the context of climate change, tap water problems are only going to become more frequent as the consequences of climate change, natural disasters, saltwater intrusion, flooding, these things will threaten our water infrastructure and drinking water supply. And so it's already happening, and we need to do what we can now before these problems become exacerbated even further. So thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, and I look forward to chatting more with you all.
All right. Thanks so much, Sam. Aubrey, I believe you are up next, and you should be a co-host and able to share your screen.
Okay. I'm using two different devices to hopefully be able to get this right. One up. Can you make the other one a co-host? Sorry.
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Who needs to be host?
Me. It's me, but it's my name should be twice.
Yeah, I see you. Okay, there we go.
Great.
Now you're co-host 2 times.
All right. Doubly a co-host. All right. Let's see.
There we go. Yep.
Great. All right. Thanks everyone for really delving in and thinking about ways to kind of think about environmental and climate justice issues. And the work that's happening in Jackson, Mississippi is really, I think, a microcosm of the conversations that we've been having at the NAACP for a number of years about what disinvestment looks like in Black communities. As was stated earlier, my name is Aubrey Connor. I'm the director for the Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at the NAACP. And I'm gonna go through first just a little bit about how we do our advocacy. So we have a 7-point advocacy model plan where we incorporate a number of different strategies. I'm going to go through some of them and how we've implemented them in Jackson, Mississippi. One of the things that we feel is really important for our work is really to center the voices of communities. And so it's not about us coming in as experts and telling folks on the ground what it is that they need, because they know. They've known, for example, in Jackson that there have been issues in the water for years. It's just really about there being an amplification of the issues that they've known exist in individuals and groups and advocacy organizations, helping to give them a platform in order to share their stories. And so all the work that we've been doing has really been grounded in what we consider community science, what we consider anecdotal evidence that is oftentimes more important than any other expertise that we would be able to find in order to figure out solutions. We look at legal advocacy, congressional and legislative advocacy, as well as on the ground organizing, mobilization efforts, and public education. So what's happening in Jackson, Mississippi is in no way something that is just, came out of the blue as it relates to how Black communities have been treated over the years as it relates to water issues. As a previous presenter kind of discussed, there is this pattern of there being water issues in Black communities. What we've seen even for hundreds of years, when, for example, you had a community like Allensworth trying to build the first Black community in California nearly a century ago. There was an issue with water there. The wells were actually given to a neighboring white community. And so they understood that they actually needed water wells in order to sustain their community. It was going to be an agricultural community in the center of California, in the Central Valley. But there was actual disinvestment and intentional kind of deprivation of them being able to have water in the infrastructure that they needed over a century ago. We continue to see that disinvestment in Black communities across the country. So some of the research that we've done, when we looked at usaspending.gov, for example, when I looked at the communities that have experienced water crises across the country, typically at the county level, because it typically only gives you as specific as county level data, those communities receive less than 2% of federal allocations of funding that flow through the state for over that year. And so when you think about, the fact that the state has all of this money that should be going potentially to places that have experienced disinvestment, that have experienced deprioritization, and that are in the midst of a crisis, you would think that there would be more funding that the state would actually allocate to those communities during the midst of a crisis and after a crisis. But this is also why we've seen that, for example, in places like Flint, in places like Benton Harbor, Michigan, in places like Lowndes County, Alabama, and others, I can go on, that it takes so long for there to be a rebuilding process that actually happens because there isn't a prioritization, there isn't an equity conversation that comes up when it comes to actually rebuilding an infrastructure in those communities. So as I was talking about earlier, what we center is equity, not equality, because when it comes to thinking about water infrastructure, when it comes to thinking about how we're going to actually fix issues around water in this country, we have to start with the communities that have experienced the most disinvestment over a number of years. And so for Jackson, for example, there have been a number of mayors who have requested funding, at least at the state level, and then also for the state to, and at the state level for them to allocate funding that they're getting from the federal government down to Jackson, Mississippi. And there has been a number of times where past governors and the current governor, the governor when he was in previous positions like lieutenant governor and treasurer, where he actively was acting against the interests of the residents of Jackson, Mississippi. There hasn't been a time, to my knowledge, at least within the last 25 years, where Hinds County has actually been the number one place where there has been funding of water infrastructure funds that could flow to Jackson, Mississippi over that time period. And so when we think about what it looks like to have equity, again, there needs to be a longer period of time where a place that's in the midst of experiencing a water crisis, there should be a prioritization of that funding into that county, into Jackson specifically. And then not over just a 1 year period, because we know that it took decades for us to get to the place that we were at in Jackson. Okay, so our strategy was really about centering equity in the treatment of Jackson's residents through advocacy and remediating the O.B. Curtis water treatment plant, and to lay the groundwork for a new facility to ensure safe, clean, affordable drinking water and a functioning wastewater and sewer system. So disinvestment in Jackson. As I alluded to earlier, there has been a number of years where there has been continuous efforts to disinvest in Jackson, Mississippi. So over the last 25 years, Jackson's only received federal funding for water infrastructure issues in 3 of those last 25 years, which I'll talk a little bit about later as well. But part of this is because the current mayor and previous mayors understood that they were fighting an uphill battle. And by uphill, that's probably too light of a term. They were fighting against every single obstacle that had been laid their way by the state government to ensure that they're not able to be prioritized in water infrastructure conversations. And this isn't just at the mayoral and the elected official levels. This is also for folks in the community. So there are a lot of community advocates, a lot of community organizers who have been trying to figure out ways to continue to participate and ensure that the amplification of the issues in Jackson have been demonstrated at a national, at an international level, but there's been silencing, there's been intentional smear campaigns by the governor. So it's not necessarily that the individuals, the residents in Jackson don't want to participate, but there's been active pushing them out of the conversations, actively ensuring that they cannot share their story, actively ensuring that they cannot participate in public comments and other kinds of ways that they can ensure that their voice is made heard. So I'll give an example of that. When it comes to intended use plans, that is the way that the state is able to ensure that the EPA knows how it's going to allocate funds down to the city level. So the state creates an intended use plan. It's supposed to be in conjunction with public participation across the state. And then individuals can say, yes, we think this intended use plan looks great. Thank you, state. Send this off to the EPA. And then at that point, the state can decide to revise it based on public comments and then send it to the EPA. When the state actually did its most recent intended use plan for the state revolving loan funding that would ensure that money for water infrastructure issues could flow to Jackson, Mississippi, the first time that it actually submitted a intended use plan, well, the draft intended use plan that it intended to submit, Jackson would have been completely precluded from being able to get funding for water infrastructure issues. And then the state decided to change and the reason why Jackson would have been precluded was because you had to have a population of fewer than 4,000 individuals who would be able to receive funding under the intended use plan. The state removed the population cap, but the previous intended use plan, you would be able to get loan forgiveness for up to $2 million. When the state revised its intended use plan, they capped loan forgiveness at $500,000. In addition to that, there was nothing on any government websites that actually outlined the public comment participation process. We actually had to find that information on a random newspaper that nobody looks at online. And we were able to find one link about the fact that they were in the midst of a public participation process in Mississippi around the intended use plan. And as I'll share a little bit later, we did a campaign around it to ensure that folks knew, because folks wanted to be involved. They were actively being pushed out of those conversations. So as I stated earlier, Jackson has received federal funding for water in only 3 of the last 25 years. And we have to think about, yes, thank God for that one tiny, yes, they satisfied their legal requirements under the law by publicizing it, but in a way that was so clearly meant to try to deprioritize the voices of community members and folks who really need to be a part of that process. So one of the past mayors was actually an urban planner, former Mayor Harvey Johnson. And so he actually had a background in infrastructure. He had a background that would help him to understand what it would actually take to fix the water infrastructure issues in Jackson. And so there were several times that he submitted information to the state to try to get more funding, to try to fix some of the issues that he saw coming, because the pipes were actually smaller in Jackson. He actually wrote a paper about how this is actually a larger issue that comes up in Black communities across the country as well, and that they needed to change the pipe size because that was going to ultimately lead to where we are in Jackson, Mississippi. A lot of those pleas were ignored. He was able to make some progress, but if there had actually been a prioritization of the water infrastructure issues in Jackson when he brought them up years ago, we likely wouldn't be at a place where it's going to cost over $2 billion to fix water issues in Jackson, Mississippi. As I stated earlier as well, the governor had, in his previous roles as lieutenant governor, as treasurer, has utilized and weaponized those positions against Jackson residents as well. So what we did, we were on the ground because we believe that it's really important to acknowledge, and not just acknowledge, but to ground any work that we're doing in what we're hearing from actual residents, what they're saying, what they're hearing. And so a lot of the residents that we talked to, and even some of the community health facilities, were saying, you know, we've known that there have been water issues for a long period of time. They knew that there was something that was happening at the state level, but they just weren't a part of the process because, again, there are a number of barriers to residents being able to participate. One being that the Mississippi legislator does not actually keep a record of what happens at the state level. And so if someone were to try to go back and figure out, well, why was this decision made? It's nearly impossible unless you have, you know, folks who you can talk to word of mouth. And so that makes it really challenging for people to be able to engage in a meaningful way. But residents have known that there have been issues. They've heard word of mouth that the water was not good. And then some of them have experienced long-term health issues. Some of them believe that they have skin diseases and other issues that have come from drinking the water. Some of them as recently as this most recent water crisis, who experienced stomach issues and other problems from drinking the water or using the water for brushing their teeth and other just daily hygienic needs. And so after having those conversations with residents and understanding that they are the best at explaining their experience and what it was that they wanted to see done, then we decided to move forward with some of the things that we heard were missing because of the smear campaign, because of the misinformation that was actively happening at the state level. So we put together a number of one-pagers that explained kind of what was happening in Jackson, why the quality of their water was important. We talked about what it actually meant, you know, when we say water infrastructure, because oftentimes people don't realize that it's multiple systems, and so that they can be the real advocates and continue to be the advocates of their own voice so that they can talk to the issues without the need for someone else to come in and say, this is how you should go about dealing with water issues in your own community. So there have been a number of different actions that have happened. There was a congressional inquiry. There will be a hearing that's going to be coming up soon that Congressman Benny Thompson and Congresswoman Maloney really led to ensure that there are some answers to some of the questions that everybody's asking, like how much money is actually going to Jackson? What are you all doing? And so that work is moving alongside some of the work that we're continuing to do. So we have a Title VI civil rights complaint that we filed with the EPA. We filed it days after the EPA Office of Civil Rights and External Civil Rights and Environmental Justice Office was open. One of the reasons we felt that it was important to prioritize that in our conversation with the EPA as well is because Administrator Regan and President Biden have stated that this is a priority, that environmental justice is a priority, and we feel that that office should be really steering the conversations for what happens next. for those who may not be as familiar with Title VI civil rights complaints, with the Title VI civil rights complaint, there can be withholding of federal funds if an entity like a state agency or any entity that receives federal funds, if they discriminate based on a number of protected categories. In this situation, we believe that Jackson was being discriminated against because it's 83% Black. And the pattern of there being disinvestment, the pattern of them not receiving funds, the fact that, I didn't mention this earlier, but the fact that Jackson is the only city in the state that has to go through 2 different processes to receive American Rescue Plan funding. It has to get approval from the Department of Finance and Administration and approval from the Department of Environmental Quality. That all of these obstacles are, it seems to be intentionally because it's a Black city. And the residents themselves have stated that they feel like if they lived in a community in a city that had more white folks, had fewer Black individuals, that the water issues would have been fixed more quickly. And that's the kind of information that the EPA and other agencies want to hear as it relates to opening up a Title VI complaint. So we're happy to announce that our Title VI complaint was open recently. And so now we're awaiting a response from the governor and the state level to see what the next actions will look like. I stated earlier the public comments regarding the intended use plan. We created an entire campaign because we knew that individuals in Jackson and across the state didn't actually realize that they were in the midst of a public comment period, and that Jackson was being deprioritized in the intended use plan. And so we have been very public about the fact that we believe that the EPA, as the enforcement arm at the agency level, as it relates to a lot of these issues, has to really be bold and be creative. In the past, the EPA has typically rubber stamped intended use plans, but we feel like to fulfill the promises of Justice 40 and to really ensure that historically disadvantaged communities are prioritized, that there may need to be a rejection or a revision to an intended use plan that the EPA is originating. So we've done a number of mobilization efforts on the ground. We've met with folks in town hall settings, in their personal homes, because again, we believe that the anecdotal evidence and the information that we're hearing from folks actually who live in the community, that they're the experts. They're the ones who have to live this every single day. And so that continues to ground how we continue to move forward with our work in Jackson, Mississippi, and it's informed and shaped how we think about our strategies. So I'll stop there. We have a landing page, which is naacp.org/Jackson. You can also follow us on social media, where we oftentimes update that about different things that we're doing in Jackson. Like right now, I'm at COP27. We just presented in the Blue Zone about this issue and how it relates to the larger global conversation on water as well.
Great, thanks so much, Abray. We appreciate that. And we'll turn the microphone over to Brooke, and then we'll get on to Q&A.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brooke Floyd. I am the coordinator for Jackson People's Assembly, which is under People's Advocacy Institute here in Jackson, Mississippi. And I'm going to share a little bit of history about myself, because I think that will speak to some of the issues that we've heard about that Aubrey spoke to. I was a teacher for a number of years here, a public school teacher. And I also ran a after school and summer camp here at a local nonprofit for a number of years, which is in, I guess, West Jackson, or the center of the city near downtown. And I speak to that because there is a reason that people here aren't aware of what's going on and the processes that the government takes and what has happened, because they have refused to fund public education here for a number of years. Because the idea, of course, is that the majority of public school children are Black. And so we are not going to put money in educating Black children. And that's really what it falls to. And so for the past on August 29th, as most of you know, we had that previous week, we had an unprecedented rains. I think the weathermen referring to it as a monsoon. And so we were just rainfall, and of course, the flooding of the Pearl River began. And with that, our plants failed. Now, we knew that that was a possibility. In my house personally, I had already started filling jugs of water because I knew there was a possibility we were going to lose water. We were going to lose access to water. And the Mississippi Rapid Response Coalition, of which People's Advocacy Institute is a lead organization on, immediately went into action a few days before and was like, hey guys, we need to watch this. There's going to be an issue. And so we began to have meetings about how can we support the community. The coalition got started at the beginning of the pandemic to support folks in Mississippi, the whole state, and based in Jackson, but we supported everyone, providing food, money, help with housing, things like that, whatever the needs were at the time. And then again, when we had a winter storm, an ice storm here, we had to help distribute water, food, and money for groceries and things like that. And so it was only natural for us to respond to this also. And so we were on the ground immediately. We partnered with the city. We are a coalition of over 30 organizations here in the city and throughout the state. And so we were on daily water distributions, bottled water. We did water so people could flush their toilets and be able to bathe. We did all that every day, Saturday through Sunday, all over the city. And we had sites set up, at least 2 sites set up in each area of the city. And so we've been on crisis mode since August 29th. Now we are trying to shift toward trying to get filters for our homes, as many homes as possible in the city, because we do know that there needs to be some type of long-term, I guess, make it through solution until our water system gets repaired. Now I'll go back to our history. Before I even lived here in the 80s, I would visit my grandparents. I was originally from Missouri, and I would come down to visit my grandmother. And she lived in West Jackson, and she boiled her water then. My grandmother never drank the tap water. She boiled her water to cook with, to wash dishes. That was the thing. You didn't even brush your teeth with the tap water. And that was in the 80s. In fact, my uncles and father and aunt went together and purchased her the big 5-gallon water dispensary, and she had it delivered every 2 weeks, just so she wouldn't have to deal with, as she got older, boiling the water. They were worried for her carrying that hot water over to her sink to wash the dishes and to cook with. So this is something that the citizens in the city have been dealing with forever, okay? As most cities in America, you know, we built on instead of going back and redoing. I lived in Chicago for a number of years, and I remember right down the street from our neighborhood in Hyde Park, they started digging and they found wooden pipes. So this is not just unique to Jackson. What makes it unique to Jackson is the fact that we have what is called Yazoo clay. So our soil shifts. So anytime we have extreme temperatures, our soil, our ground cracks and shifts and moves. So if you have pipes that haven't been replaced since the 1800s, that's a recipe for disaster. Okay, and now we have the constant onslaught of extreme temperatures, of which Jackson is not used to. Now we are used to hot, okay? It's the South, we're used to hot. We are not used to having extreme cold temperatures every winter. When I first moved here in the late 80s, I think our average was every 7 years snowfall. Okay, we are experiencing some type of snow or ice precipitation every single winter. That is unprecedented for the South, and it's something that our city and our infrastructure just cannot handle or cannot take. And as you heard earlier, I already said that the governor that we have in office now, it was found, and we knew this, now we just have proof that he purposely, as a treasurer, as lieutenant governor, when bills would come up that would add, infrastructure monies and help us in our city to rebuild, he purposely would not let them go to committee. And he has been quoted on a radio show, a conservative radio show from, I think this was the 90s, maybe early 2000s, joking about how he would stop those things from going through. And so you have a continued disinvestment, divestment in the city. You have a state continued disinvestment as far as public education, healthcare. In our state, our hospitals, rural hospitals have all but shut down. People are driving and dying just to get to a hospital for an asthma attack, for childbirth. We have food deserts everywhere, and Jackson, I think, is the larger picture of what's going on throughout the state. So you have a city that when I first moved here was very racially divided. The Black folks lived on one side, the white folks lived on the other. And you had your wealthier Black neighborhoods, and then you had a large area of poor Black neighborhoods. And then you had the white neighborhoods, which were mostly middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy. And then you had a fewer poor white neighborhoods. Well, now we are, we had the shift that most cities had in the 90s, where everybody moved to the suburbs if you had money, and the people that were left did not. And so I remember in the 80s for, I think we had our previous two white mayors before our first Black mayor, which was Harvey Johnson. They requested money for infrastructure repairs and were denied. And that was when our population was starting to shift. And every mayor since Dale Danks and Kane Ditto have requested, and those were our last two white mayors, have requested money for infrastructure repairs from the state, and they have been denied. And not only that, the other economic developments that could have come here, that would have brought millions of dollars in revenue, that would have enabled us to fix it ourselves, they have denied those bills from also going through. This past legislative session, there was a wonderful new development that would have brought probably billions of dollars in revenue eventually, that our governor refused to sign because he said we needed to get our water issues under control and our violence under control. Now, we all know that in order to do both of those things, you need money. And he denied us a very profitable economic development that would have seen tourism shoot through the roof and would have brought millions of dollars here, and he denied it. And so right after that, of course, the story that had already broken I guess it was early 2020, about our governor, who is governor now, but he seems to be escaping the guilt on this, or whatever you want to call it. The TANF scandal and welfare scandal, where he and Brett Favre and the previous governor, Phil Bryant, just had a field day with millions of dollars and did whatever they wanted to, instead of giving it to our families, our most neediest families who needed food. Now, that is one example of how they are denying the very people that need it the most here help. So not only are you denying us water, but you are now denying us food. So think about that. You're in a city where I think we're 80% Black, and that was from the census, so I don't trust that. I would go even further. I would say we're about 95% Black and brown. We have a large Hispanic community that is growing, and they did not respond to the census, and I wouldn't have either. And so just because they were leery of what was going on, we had raids and things that had happened previously. People were taken. And so it was a very tumultuous time when they were trying to do that. And it was like, no trust. And when Sam was speaking about the no trust of the government, I was like, come to Jackson. We come to Mississippi. We have a very, very healthy distrust of government, and don't believe that they have our best interests at heart. And I completely agree most times with that, just on how we've been treated. For myself, when I was pregnant in 2016, my OBGYN explicitly stated, do not drink the water. Yeah, I was pregnant with twins. I was already, a risky pregnancy. I was advanced maternal age, and he was like, do not drink the water. When I had my twins, they were like, please do not make, and I'm sorry, that's our dog. Please do not make your formula with the water. My children are 6. They have never drank the tap water. They have never brushed their teeth with the tap water. When we have the extreme issues like we did on the 29th, where there was a, complete citywide loss, and the water was, things were floating in our water. My children bathed with boiled water, or I went and got jugs from some of the dispensaries. And then I literally took a bottle of water, warmed it up, and washed their face, just because I didn't want to risk. 6-year-olds can't keep their mouths and eyes closed when you're washing their face. And I didn't want to risk anything. As an educator, I am concerned on so many levels. I used to teach little ones. And so we know that any amount of lead in the water is unsafe. So we have, and it's funny to me that no one has connected the dots. We have this huge increase in violence in Jackson, okay, with all these babies, okay, these young, beautiful babies are committing violence and having violence committed against them. And lo and behold, there's been lead in the water for 50 years. I mean, come on now, let's connect the dots. What are the things that cause here? You all these things have been built up. We're doing all these things, and we have cut these folks off from everything that you need to have basic comforts and your needs met in life. And then we're pointing the finger because violence has increased. Right now, we are leading every month. We just went to every month. We were doing every 2 weeks, a march on the governor's mansion, where we literally set and demand that they give us money to fix our water. Because if you heard Aubrey earlier, money has been there. It has come down, and it was supposed to go to Jackson, and it is not. We are not the only city in the state that does not have clean water. There are multiple brown and Black cities in the state whose water is brown, have things floating in it, and they have just lived with it. The only difference with us and them is that our system failed first. Okay, our plants couldn't function. And then, even though that they have been sending money, and the federal government just said, oh, we're giving all these millions of dollars, and the state hurry up and gave us, I think, 35 million of the rescue plan money. I think it was last week or week before last, because of all this uproar. It still is nowhere near the 1.4 billion that it's going to cost to fix it now. Our previous mayor, the first mayor, Lumumba, and I say that 2 mayors ago now, the father of our current mayor, he, through people's assemblies, went around and said, how can we do this? Because at that time, the cost was not as extreme. Okay. We all decided that we wanted to tax ourselves. Let's add a 1% sales tax and use that money to fix our water. We all voted. Overwhelmingly, it passed. The businesses were on board. Everybody, yes, let's fix our water. The state then came in. That Mayor Lumumba passed away. We had another mayor. The state came in and appointed a state-appointed commission to oversee our 1% sales tax revenue. We now do not even have control over the tax money that we voted for to fix our own water. Now, that commission is made up of Jackson residents. None of those residents look like me. They all live on a side of town where the majority of us don't live. They are extremely wealthy and they are friends of the governor. They made rules. For example, one of them is we will not use the money to fix pipes that are broken or messed up, sewage pipes, unless you're building a new road. Well, that excludes almost every sewer line in the city that breaks because we're not building new roads. They're already here. And so they have used this to harm us even more. And then, like Aubrey said, use smear campaigns to then point the finger at the administration and the people that have been in power in the city, acting like they have misused money or not looked out for the best interests of the people, which is infuriating and frustrating at the same time. Because as a resident that has lived here on and off for, 30 something years, close to 40 now, I know what really happened. But then again, I am from a family where my father was in the news and that was his life's work. So I had to stay abreast of what was going on at the dinner table. You were expected to talk about it. Everybody didn't grow up like that, and the schools are definitely not telling you what's going on. And so you have and that's what's so important about the work that I do with the People's Assemblies. People don't know. People have no idea. And then they're being kept from the electoral process on purpose. We make it so hard to vote here. We make it so hard to get accurate information about what is going on. And then they try to make sure that the people that are trying to provide that access have every roadblock put in front of them. So it makes it almost impossible to get it out. So we literally are having to go door to door to explain to people what is really happening, what's happening with their water, what's going on with the city, what's going on with the state, and how we can help them make it through this crisis, but also navigate the future for what is going to happen as we continue to do this, and hopefully get masses engaged so we can pressure and shame the state of Mississippi into action. Mississippi only moves when it's shamed into action. That's the only reason the civil rights movement was successful. Mississippi was shamed. And so now we're going to have to shame them again to fix our water. And I'll be quiet because I can go on forever.
Thank you, Brooke. I was just about to try to jump in there, but you beat me to it. So folks, I didn't want to cut anybody off. This has all been such great content, and thanks Sam and Ray and Brooke. But we do still have 25 minutes left for questions. So you know the drill. Let me know you've got one and I'll call on you. And I apologize in advance. We probably won't have time to get to all the questions, but you will get everyone's contact information and have plenty of ways of reaching everyone who spoke to us today. And Amy, you can go first.
Yeah, I mean, the word heartbreaking doesn't begin to cover what you are experiencing there in your community. And I just have to ask, like, what do you need? Like, what can we do as professional communicators to help, your community and help, other communities across the country that are experiencing these kinds of issues?
Share the story. I think the news cycles go so fast and people get forgotten very quickly. This is not over. As you heard, that this has been going on for years. The kids missed 1 week of school this past time. And since that, we've had several schools, not the whole district, but several schools that have had to shut down because pipes have broken. And so they've had to go virtual, or they've had to be moved to another site. And winter has not really arrived here yet. Okay, so I am worried because we know winter is coming. My other thing is that when we had this previously, and we've had issues before, when I was teaching, one time we did not go back to school from Christmas break to almost Valentine's Day. And that was before the pandemic, so there was no virtual school. So these are the types of things that need to be told. They need to be amplified. We've got to get help. We need help to get filters out. We need help to get water to people. And it needs to be an ongoing process until our water gets fixed.
And I'll just add very briefly that the governor is still doing press conferences about this issue, and he now feels like he has an open forum to kind of say whatever it is that he wants to say, because he feels like there's not, maybe the same level of amplification and like zeroing in on him lying as there was before. So just wanted to name that is actively happening, because again, we have an active civil rights complaint against agencies at the state level as well.
Okay, thanks. We'll go on to OSHA.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, all three of you. I have a couple of questions. One for Aubrey. You mentioned, I think it was Ellenburg, California, the place where the wells were taken by the white neighboring communities. I just wanted to know how I could find out more about that specific site as an example. The other question I had was for Brooke, and thank you for sharing your information too. I'm also interested in finding out the name of the commission that, and who I think you said the governor may have appointed them, I'm not sure, but who gets to decide what happens to the 1 cent sales tax. So thank you.
Yeah. So the community in California is Allensworth, and I actually know some of the organizers there who are actively working to ensure that their story is amplified in the struggles that they've had over a number of years. I used to do work there, and so I'm happy to connect you with some of the folks on the ground there in Allensworth if you'd like to talk with them. I'll put my email in there. Okay.
And our previous governor, Phil Bryant, actually appointed the first commission, and they are just called the 1% sales tax commission. And so when one of them cycles out, the current governor, Tate Reeves, replaces them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both. Claire had a question.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you to all for presentations. Water is something I'm really interested in, water access. My question is for Sam. How did you get the data? So data journalism is increasingly becoming a tool. How did you get your data specifically for the water kiosks?
So we decided to focus on the standalone kiosks, which means that kiosks that are located inside Walmart or grocery stores, we didn't look at because we felt there was something inherently different from a research perspective of having to drive there specifically for a trip to buy water. Mm-hmm. We also felt that these kiosks represented local demand because they're franchises. They can't exist in an area if local demand's not there as a standalone business. Mm-hmm. So I actually developed a way to what we call ground truth the data. So we focused on the 2 major franchises in the US Watermill Express, which is the one pictured, and Ice House America, which are blocks. There's other kiosk companies, including mom and pop shops. I'm starting a new project in Iowa to collect smaller franchises there. But what I did is I worked with a team of undergraduate researchers, and we collected they're private companies, right? So they want people to know where they can purchase water from. So we took the addresses from their website, and using Google Maps, we double checked all those addresses. And then we would use Google Street View to travel to these places to see if there was a kiosk actually there. This also gives a lot of qualitative data, right? So I know in Houston, these things are often located in the parking lots of dollar stores or in Hispanic food markets, right? The other cool thing about working within the Google Maps platform is we were able to identify kiosks that were missing from the company's websites because they're franchises. And so we were able to add additional companies and build a pretty detailed data set on the locations of these two companies in particular.
Can I ask you one more question about just like regulating and cleanliness? So like they're not being fed by the public municipal water supply. So like they are served by these water trucks that bring them from where?
So we wrote this book during COVID. So a lot of the things we planned on doing, we couldn't actually do, but it's our belief that they actually do tap into the municipal water supply. And so, for example, there's a kiosk company in Iowa called Highland Kiosks. And on their website, they say that they tap into the municipal water supply. And then they market based off of the treatment. So a lot of them say that they use reverse osmosis to treat the water, or a 7-step process. But for these kiosks themselves, we believe that it's municipal water that may or may not be treated. So I have a new grant where we're actually going to be doing some water quality testing of these kiosks to see if the water quality is what they say it is. Yeah, so.
Interesting. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Sam. Mara, you're up.
Yeah, thanks. This is kind of related to Amy's question, but I'm a local news reporter, and I was just reflecting, Bray, about what you said about like that one newspaper that nobody reads. That was like the only place where people could find the info about the public comment period. And then Brooke, what you were saying about like, it was just so hard to get information out. You had to go door to door and like talk to people individually about what's happening. So I'm wondering like how especially local news outlets can make our work like more useful to you in these moments of crisis, but also like not in moments of crisis. Yeah.
Well, I can start. I think that, it's super, I think that if no one's really monitoring like when an intended use plan may be, up for like approval, it's somewhat hard to know when that is happening. But I do think that to the extent that there may be someone who, is able to kind of monitor when that typically would happen in that state, because sometimes it varies from state to state, then it could be helpful for someone at local news to see, like, is there anything on like the state's kind of Department of Environmental Quality or Department of Health websites that would allude to the fact that maybe there would be a period that's upcoming that public should be able to participate in. So if it's related to an intended use plan, or if it's related to, I don't know, some updates to like technical guidance or something like that, having folks actually, at the local level who can kind of also help to monitor and then flag for community groups, because I mean, we're trying to keep our eyes and ears to the things that are upcoming, but we obviously can't do it all. And the more that local reporters also give those flags, that can be helpful for groups who are doing advocacy as well.
And I would just add to that, I think it's very important to mention that here, when all this went on, the news reported, of course, on the immediate crisis. Okay. It was the national news and the national publications that were reporting on the whole story. It was like the local news would not move past the immediate issue and refuse to delve deeper in what was going on. Now, whether, and I'm sure politics had to play in that and everything else, because Jackson is the capital city, but we are very much still a small town. And everyone knows everybody, everyone's connected. And especially those in the media, you know, you have a relationship with the governor's mansion or with the legislators or whatever. So I'm sure that played a part in that. But it was not until the national media and the newspapers from other and magazines from other places started saying, hey, this is, you know, systemic racism. This is environmental racism. This is, and then the local media was like, oh, well, it was divestment in Jackson, da, 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 da. And it was an afterthought. And they still did not run a huge story like all these national programs did. And so I think it was, and like I said before, the shame, Mississippi being shamed, and then it was allowed, they were allowed to kind of speak to that. And I'm not throwing media under the bus. I am definitely a media kid. My dad was the department head at multiple TV stations my whole life. So I'm all about that. However, I do know that what happens here, because he worked here for a number of years, and I do know how things are pushed and held back and not allowed. And I really feel like that's what happened.
Thanks, Brooke. Ashley had a question next.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming here today. And also Brooke, I really feel you as a former breaking news producer on all of that, not going deeper in the story. So with that, I do some reporting in Tennessee, and hearing the challenges of finding data really resonated with me, and having to rely on that anecdotal evidence. But my experience is, so I'll even take that anecdotal evidence as a reporter to electeds and agencies, and they will push back on me because they'll just say, oh, that's one, I'm sure you've experienced this. And so I'm curious how you've handled that pushback and navigated that.
Well, I can say one of the things that, you know, is important, I don't know how to say this, but sometimes, you know, if like, for example, in Mississippi, like the governor is not necessarily going to care, unfortunately, what residents are saying, but what he will care about is if there's an open civil rights complaint that's based on the evidence, the anecdotal evidence of residents. And now, you know, there is a mechanism to streamline the anecdotal evidence that we're hearing into a formal mechanism to make him respond. And so I think that it's not even necessarily, you know, always trying to get that person at the state level to respond in that moment, but continuing to get those stories, continuing to build spaces for that is helpful, because even if they don't respond in the moment or feel like they need to say anything in the moment, there are other formal mechanisms that can make them respond. So, you know, maybe it's an administrative complaint, maybe it's a lawsuit, maybe it's, you know, congressional testimony. One of the things that I really highlighted when I talked with the Committee on Homeland Security in congressional testimony a little over a month ago was anecdotal evidence. And that moved Congressman Benny Thompson and many of the other congressional members to say, well, we need to do something immediately. And we were able to get $20 million streamlined to Jackson days after the congressional hearing ended. So even if, you know, they don't do anything in the moment, I still think that, you know, it's helpful in other avenues. I know it's not a direct answer, but hopefully it's helpful to understanding how, even if they don't respond, it's still helpful in pretty much every other video.
And I do think especially in a place like Mississippi, anecdotal evidence sometimes is all we have, because the real data is not going to be released or they don't have it. For example, I'm working on a criminal justice thing right now where we're trying to do reformative justice, transformative justice, and bring a program to Jackson. And we have asked for the prison data and who's being arrested and who's being held in our state jail, but also prison, excuse me, in our local jail. And there are whole sections missing, like just gone, like people weren't, they were there. We know they're there, but they don't even exist on record. So they are just not keeping records. And if they have them, they are not releasing them. So that is a very real problem that a lot of the reporters I know have had here. For example, for the TV station WLBT, where my father previously worked, and my husband actually, they have asked repeatedly and gone to court to ask for data on several issues: water, jails, crime, whatever. And they have been denied access, even through the court order. So anecdotal evidence in Mississippi, unfortunately, is the data. I mean, that is what we have to go on. And then later down the line, sometimes because of all the anecdotal evidence and the amount of people that are like, wait a minute, this is what they're saying, this happened, this really happened, then they'll release some tidbits. And you can kind of piece together what has happened.
All right,
Thank you
thank
both
you.
so much.
Sporty.
Yeah, hi. I have a kind of a, zoomed out question with regards to any public service. And Sam, to your point of, how public distrust in governments can lead to deteriorating public service. I was just curious if the three of you have any like actions or like concrete things of how the public can do this. Are grassroots levels of, organization the only way, or are there some kind of, multi-pronged approach to facing issues like this, where people resort to private services in lieu of public services?
The reason I'll say this real quick, I just was in a meeting with the city Monday about how they can gain trust again, because they have lost it in the city. And one of the things that I spoke to was that people have to see you. They have to know that you are hearing them. It's not necessarily that you can help them, but that you hear them, what they are going through, and you acknowledge the pain. Because on the flip side of this, while we are going through this, you have people in this city that have extremely high water bills. Okay, because we had a horrible contract with Simon, Siemens, whoever they are, and they screwed us over royally. And the meters were wrong, and they didn't work right all over the city. And so people were getting either no water bills for months at a time. Some people didn't get them for years. Some people were receiving, myself, I received a $15,000 water bill, and I had been receiving one every month. Okay. And so these are the types of things that have led to distrust of the city, even though it wasn't necessarily the city's fault. First you give me brown water with stuff floating in it, and now I got to pay $15,000 for it. Okay, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And so we have been working with the city to try, and US Water Alliance is helping with this too, on how to build trust with the community. And the thing is, you have to show up and you have to say you're going to do what you're going to do when you say it. So if I say that I'm going to give you a call back once I find out some information about why your street has a big waterfall flowing through it right now, then I need to do that in a timely manner instead of waiting 2 weeks after the sewage has been running through your yard where your kids play for days on end. And a lot of that has to do staffing, we know, and all those things, but people need to receive the call to explain that to them instead of glossing it over and acting like, we're just not going to deal with it. And so that is something that the city has to work on. We are helping them work on that, but it's a process. You have to show up for people at all times.
I totally agree with what Brooke is saying. And so I'll just add the 10,000 foot view here. Really 10,000 foot view, right? So democratic theory suggests that the legitimacy of any government is based on its ability to provide people with basic services. And when government fails to do that, it's no longer legitimate. And so that's where obviously this applies to drinking water in this huge way, but we can also think about other basic services that government provides and how when government fails people, it produces the rational response is to not trust your government anymore. And so what was I going to say? That's a 10,000 foot view. A lot of current, so I believe researchers' role is to just elevate what people already know, right? And so a lot of research in my field suggests that it's a marketing problem on government's behalf, where like people just don't understand what government does for them, or people don't understand the work that government does. And that's part of it, right? Because like their government services, as we've heard, are not transparent, both in a way that's intentionally malicious, but also in a way that's just not well done. But it's also this problem of like government just has to do a better job. And that's what we mean when we say government has to provide excellent service. It's not enough that your water is clean or doesn't have stuff in it, but it also has to taste good because people have to want to drink it. And when we talk about equity, our book is written for like three audiences, right? Researchers, the general public, but then also the water industry, because we really want water utilities to hear this message that it's their responsibility to reinvest in these communities that haven't been invested in. And so we want that message to be taken in because if you do these things, hopefully you can, in the words of our book, reverse this cycle that you see and start to rebuild trust in government overall. But it starts with being able to provide basic services that are equitable, open, and excellent.
All right, thanks, Sam, and thanks, Brooke. I think we've got time for one last question. Meher, you are next in line, so go for it. You're there somewhere. Are you muted?
Whoops, sorry. I was trying to rush. I'm going to ask this really, really quickly because I know we're short on time. Thank you so much, Samantha, Aubrey, and Brooke. You all have talked about an issue that I'm very interested in and passionate about and reporting on here in Maine as well in various aspects. So I'm curious to know, we all kind of talked about Jackson, and I think all three of you really, pointed out the fact that this isn't just a Jackson issue. It exacerbated and blew up here, but there are other cities that you're seeing this in. And so as reporters, I think all of us would be interested to know if there are any cities that, are on your radar right now that are either emblematic of this level of abuse and neglect by government funding and structures, or if there are cities where you see this really, exacerbating and collapsing next that should be spotlighted and on the radar. And this is for all of you and the work that you do. I think you all must have come across this.
I'll start just with the broad data picture. Cities, local places with higher populations of Black residents, higher populations of Hispanic residents are much more likely to experience tap water failure. So they're much more likely to have health violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And these failures are exacerbated when Black and Hispanic communities are also low income. And so this is like a national, this is just the national reality, is that communities that are Black, Hispanic, and low income, their water is not as safe to drink as other places.
I will say that just since this has started, I've come across some, but having lived here and known people and gone to college here, I have known people from Moss Point, Mississippi, friends of mine from college. I remember going to visit them and going to get a cup to get some water and them running and screaming, "Don't drink the water." And then taking the shower in their bathroom and realizing why, because the water had stuff floating in it. And this was in what, 99? I was in college in the late 90s, early 2000s. So that was then. There were 5 cities, I think, this last legislative session that asked for ARPA money for infrastructure specifically. I think it was Hattiesburg, Greenwood. Is it Greenwood or Greenville? I get the two confused. One is predominantly Black and one is predominantly white. And the predominantly Black city is who asked for money. Let's see, there were several others. They did not receive the amount they requested, but they did receive some funds. It is not enough to repair everything. And so when this story kind of broke, and on Twitter, when I was following MississippiToday.org, which is one of the news sources that kind of has been breaking the undercover stories here, there were multiple people from all across Mississippi saying they need to come to my town. My water is horrible. It smells so bad when it comes out of the faucet. I'm scared to have my babies drink it. All of the cities that were listed were predominantly Black. Now, some of our rural towns are on a well system, so they're a little bit different. And so their water is not the same, even the Black ones, because they're smaller. And so they don't have the same systems in place and the infrastructure that we have that is so old. And so they're a little bit different. And so they have escaped this systemic racism. But the other towns that are bigger and the smaller cities do have these issues. And they have been repeatedly denied the same way. You can see the shift though, when the leadership is Black. When those predominantly Black towns switch from white leadership to Black leadership, the disinvestment got worse. And then the infrastructure, because that old thinking that Black people can't handle money, that Black people in charge don't need to be in charge of that large amount of money. You can see immediately when Black leadership comes into play that the disinvestment begins on a whole nother level than it was before.
Thanks, Brooke. Ray, did you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, because I know we're over time, but looking forward to if there are any follow-ups, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, so just so everyone knows, this room full of journalists with tiny heads staring at you all will have your contact information. So I'm sure you'll be hearing from them. Journalists, can we thank our speakers? Give them a round of applause. And we truly appreciate you being here. This was an excellent session. I can't say enough good things about it. I think this is just crucially important. And I'm glad we got to spend our morning with you talking about it.